Record. All right. So we got photosynthesis here. We'll be kind of going over the entire process. We talk about photosynthesis first because it basically introduces what we're going to be going and talking about in the next chapter, which is cellular respiration. And it's very similar to this, to photosynthesis. And this is going to be much more simpler. It may not seem like it when we start going in and talking about it, but when it comes to cellular respiration, what happens in the mitochondria, there's quite a bit more that happens and is going on. So this is kind of that introduction to it, kind of dipping the toe into what we're going to see in the next chapter here. So let's get into it here. Again, we kind of talked about some of this nonsense when we looked at the lecture in the last period here, where we talked about photosynthesis being the sun is the creator of all that. The book gets into a little bit there. They just talk about some of the interesting aspects of photosynthesis and, you know, really why it's necessary to kind of know it. Probably none of you are going to go into research science at all, and that's fine. But I left this in here just to kind of, so you can see that they do a lot of cool things with trying to figure out how to manipulate a plant, manipulate photosynthesis with the ability to use it as a energy source, as a way to make various different products. You see a lot of this with supplements too, where they have algae that actually can grow some of the omegas, the omega-3, 6 products that you can buy. There's algae-based ones. So they do a lot of stuff with plants. They can manipulate their genome pretty easily. If you ever go to a big university here in the Midwest, there's always a huge number of labs that are devoted to looking at the genome of corn and trying to manipulate it to see if you can make it a more viable biofuel. It does have its issues, but that's what I'm not going to ask any questions off it, just to kind of spark a interest for you to go look through. Again, here's where we started, right? We talked about this the other day. All life depends on solar energy. If we have no sun, we have no plants. Plants are autotrophs, remember? Here's that word again, all right? They produce their own food. That's all that means, okay? These are plants that we're going to be talking about. This is also including algae, cyanobacteria that you see in a lot of ocean waters and bodies of water, all right? A lot of these things transform that solar energy into chemical energy, carbohydrates. We can't do that, but then we're going to eat the plants, or we're going to eat the animals that eat the plants. And then we're going to get that chemical energy. So it all begins here with the autotrophs, okay? Photosynthesis is that process that captures the solar energy. Again, a little bit of review, a little bit of rehash, I get it, okay? Take that energy, change it into a different form, okay? Into chemical energy. And then plants will, as we'll find out here at the end, they're going to put it into use in a multiple number of ways. Make structure, make fruit that provides sustenance for other animals, okay? They can store it for later use, for a rainy day, okay? Can make structures. So this energy that we end up storing as carbohydrate can be shuttled into a number of different avenues depending upon the need of the plant. Again, we need photosynthesizers, we need these autotrophs, because heterotrophs need the autotrophs. Okay? Heterotrophs cannot make their own energy. So we got to get it from the autos, right? And this is definitely a rehash of what we discussed in the last lecture. Where photosynthesis takes place is going to be important, okay? Where the steps of cellular respiration, as we talk about next week, that's going to be really important. So knowing the structures, the anatomy, if you will, okay, of where these things are occurring is going to be important. We looked at some of these organelles when we talked about chapter 4 in the cell. So now you're going to be putting them to use. All right. So hopefully you didn't just dump everything that you learned in the last unit, because now we're going to be putting it to some work here. So where does photosynthesis take place? Haha, in a plant, duh. But when you look at the plant, you can see it has some basic cellular type of structure, where we have here in our skin, where we have epidermal cells. It has an epidermal layer, an upper and a lower. Again, this just defines it. It's a boundary, it's a barrier. That's all it is. And then we have a number of cells within it called mesophyll cells. And this is where we're going to have a lot of action happening. It's within these mesophyll cells that we're going to have photosynthesis occurring and happening. Specifically, right, within the chloroplast. And you knew that already from chapter 4. So that's nothing new to you. Okay. But you can see inside this little bitty chloroplast right here, this little green dude, okay? And that's all those little green balls there, okay? All those little green balls. Excuse me. Within there, it has it's a double membrane structure, organelle, right? Has an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and we'll see the same basic structure when we look at a mitochondria. It'll have a double membrane associated with it. We have a fluid-filled region called a stroma. And then we have this stack of pennies, I like to think of it, called granum. A granum is made of a number of thylakoids. Ta-da. Pretty easy. You're like, no, it's not. It is. Okay. A leaf has a top layer and a bottom layer. It's referred to as an epidermis. Epidermis is always the outermost layer. Your skin. This is epidermis. Okay. We just have one layer. Of course, we subdivide it. I don't want to bore you with anatomy, even though that's more fun. All right. So we have the epidermis. We have this cuticle, like a waterproofing type of layer, if you want to know. That's what it is. Whoops. Yep. And then we have the mesophills, and this is where photosynthesis is going to happen. Where photosynthesis happens. Specifically, though, it happens within the chloroplast, right? Okay. This is where we have my photosynthetic pigments that we're going to talk about. In the chloroplast, we have a fluid-filled space referred to as a stroma, and we have a stack of pennies, I like to call them, called granum. Those granum are made up of individual pennies. Those individual pennies are called thylakoids. All right, and you can see here's a thylakoid, and it has its own little space. It has its own little membrane. Who cares? Thylakoids. And that's what I kind of try to talk about here a little bit, all right? So there's that I pointed out. Chloroplast, again, are those specialized structures that carry out photosynthesis, okay? Again, those chloroplasts are found within the mesophyll cells, the mesophyll tissue. Obviously, to undergo photosynthesis, we talked about this at the very end of the last lecture. We need a few things, right? We need sunlight, duh. But we also need carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets in via the stomata. There you go. It's just an opening on the underside of the leaf. And we need water. Well, I hope you could, I hope you could put those two together. Roots come from the ground, water coming up in from the ground, right? So we have that, that root system there underneath the plants. that are going to be absorbing that water and conducting it up through various different vascular tissues. It's called xylem and phloem. You don't need to know the names. Okay. So the water is coming up from the root system, from the ground. And then carbon dioxide, we exhale. And that carbon dioxide enters through little openings on the underside of the leaf, referred to as stomata. Okay, so that's how we get all of these basic building blocks, basic components for photosynthesis to occur. Roots, stomata, and chloroplast. Within the chloroplast, specifically, in that thylakoid membrane, that's where we have these things called chlorophyll. I'm just going to put this down here. Man, people are having a hard time today. There we go. All right. The thylakoid membrane is specifically going to be that region that is housing our photosynthetic pigments. Chlorophyll is the vast majority of photosynthetic pigments that we have. Okay. There's also carotenoids, there's xanthophylls, there's a few different ones, all right? But chlorophyll is the one I have on this page, and then there's one other one that we'll need to know about here, carotenoids, I believe, okay? It's these photosynthetic pigments that are actually doing the absorbing of solar energy. Who utilizes or who absorbs solar energy? The chloroplast. Specifically, it's those pigments, those photosynthetic pigments that are found within that thylakoid membrane, okay, within the thylakoid structure. That is what is absorbing the solar energy, and that is what's going to kickstart photosynthesis when we start talking about it here in a few slides. In this process, what are we doing? We're basically jazzing up electrons. And what in the world do I mean when we say jazz up? We energize, okay? It's like filling them up with fuel, all right? They're going to be ready to go. They're going to be bouncing around. They're going to be ready to do work. And that work is to make ATP. We're going to have some stuff happening within the stroma as well. That's happening in the thylakoid membrane. Okay? In the stroma, that's where we're going to make sugar. Okay? In the stroma, we form sugar. Remember, that's called that carbohydrate. D-R-A-T-E. Okay, my carbohydrate. Okay. So, the anatomy. Plant, leaf is where all this jazz is happening. Okay, it's not happening in the bark, not happening anywhere else. Okay, it's happening in the leaf. When you look at a leaf, it has an outer kind of waterproof layer called a cuticle. We have something very similar. Okay, it's just called keratinized tissue. Underneath that keratin, we have an upper epidermal tissue and on the underside of the leaf, a lower epidermal tissue. Okay, it's a barrier. That's all it is. Sandwiched in between those two things, we have mesophyll cells. And in those mesophyll cells, or within collectively the mesophyll tissue, we have our chloroplast within these guys, or girls, whatever. These chloroplasts, these are the ones that carry out photosynthesis. Who specifically inside the chloroplast? Well, it's in those thylakoids. And we stack them up, okay, and it's referred to as a granum. When you look at the thylakoid itself, it has a membrane. Everything does. And it's that membrane that we find our photosynthetic pigments. Those photosynthetic pigments are what are capturing that solar energy, and now we're getting jazzed up. We're getting energized. What else do I need? I need water. I get that from the root system. Brings it on up. Adhesion, cohesion, right? Helps to carry that water up the plant. What else? We need carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide enters into the leaf via the underside opening called a stomata. The last part that we didn't talk about is the stroma, just a fluid-filled space within the chloroplast. That is where we make carbohydrates, okay? So I have ATP, I'm energizing electrons, all of that's in the thylakoid membrane, and then I get to make everyone's favorite sugar out in that stroma. And it's that sugar, that carbohydrate, that I can make into whatever in the heck I want to, because I'm the plant and I say so. All right. So that's all of the anatomy of it. Okay. That's all the anatomy of it. So let's take a look and see what we're going to be looking at here.
Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated.
And there they're showing you the membrane there at the very end. And that's where we've got our photosynthetic pigments, okay? So that's where we're going with this. This is what we're going to look at here, okay? We're going to look at these light-dependent reactions. And they used to be called light-independent reactions or dark reactions. Now they just refer to as the Calvin cycle, okay? I think it was first called dark reactions. And then they realized that was bunk because it could happen when there is light, that Calvin cycle. And so they had to get rid of the moniker dark reactions because that was just a lie. So, and you're like, well, I mean, you're like, why would that be? I mean, photosynthesis, the sun is out. I mean, the sun's out right now. All these plants are soaking it up and making energy, making ATP. Well, that's not every plant is the same, all right?
Within eukaryotic...
All right, so we have, and get the color that I like. Okay, so like the video said, when it comes to photosynthesis, there are a number of different parts to this thing. Just like we'll see with cellular respiration, okay? Just like we'll see with cellular respiration. Here in photosynthesis, our two major steps is one, called the light reactions, and two, it's referred to as Calvin cycle reactions, okay? And it's that Calvin cycle that was once referred to as dark reactions. Excuse me, we don't call it that anymore, okay? Calvin cycle can take place during the day when there's light, okay? So that does not matter. So where do light reactions take place? Duh, they take place in the presence of the sun. So where are these going to be happening? In the chloroplast, specifically in those thylakoid structures, all right? Place only in the presence of light, hence the name light reactions. You guys are all masters of the English language, you got that. But these light reactions, these are going to be these photosynthetic pigments involved here. So they're going to be absorbing that solar energy. So they're going to be energy capturing type of reactions here, all right? So chlorophyll, carotenoids, xanthophylls, your photosynthetic pigments, all of those are going to be absorbing that energy. And how these guys absorb that energy is basically by exciting electrons. Within each of these pits of photosynthetic pigments, there are a number of electrons there, okay? And it's those electrons inside the photosynthetic pigments that are actually absorbing that energy, okay? And then we're going to be able to take that electron and we're going to be able to move it around and use it to make a buttload of ATP, okay? We're also going to help to make this stuff called NADPH. Both of these come from the light reaction. Both of these aid the plant in providing ATP, energy currency, right? So it can do stuff. It's also going to allow us to make the carbohydrate, to make the sugar. Okay? So I can incorporate it into my structure and I can get bigger. So I can flower, or I can produce fruit, which other animals eat. And then they carry those seeds away and then drop them in the ground when they poop. And now I can spread my wings, sort of say, right? I can have transportation of this plant to other locations and I can increase my population that way, all right? So this ability to make ATP and NADPH is a necessary thing to help fund the Calvin cycle, to help fund this ability to create carbohydrates. The creation of these two things happens within this light reaction region. Okay, so this is what we're talking about right here. Okay, solar energy coming on in. Again, where do I have my photosynthetic pigments? I have them within the thylakoid membrane. So that's where we're going to be absorbing that energy and energizing these electrons. Can of corn so far. Light reactions take place within the thylakoid, specifically the thylakoid membrane. Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. This is where we make the carbs. The energy to fund the production of this making of carbohydrates is actionable because of what we do in those light-dependent reactions, making ATP and making NADPH. Okay. Calvin cycle gets its name just because of the dude that discovered it first, or at least got it into a paper first, Melvin. And I mean, who doesn't like to say Melvin? Okay. I probably won't ask it. I might, because I'm that kind of guy, because I think it's funny. But Melvin all discovered this whole nonsense, and that's why we give it this moniker, this name. So this is going to be involving, as you can see, oxidation reduction, those words that we introduced in the last lecture. For photosynthesis, what gets reduced? Carbon dioxide gets reduced. Water gets oxidized. So we're going to use water, right? I said it was part of the things that we needed. Water's going to get oxidized. Water's basically getting destroyed. And we'll see here in a second why that is. Okay. So there we go. I mean, there's our overview. Solar energy coming in. Need water. Need CO2. Okay. Light reactions, again, allow us the ability to create ATP, create NADPH. Both of those are going to be necessary to fund the Calvin cycle. We need water. Water is going to be a necessary thing that is going to be, as you can see, needed in the light reactions, and we'll talk about this here in a second. And then CO2, that gets absorbed in as well. Where is that going to be utilized? Within that Calvin cycle, okay? So it's going to be utilized out in that stroma, okay? We're just building and building and building here. Pigments. We have, as you can see here, three major types of pigments. I'm not going to distinguish between chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B for us on the lecture exam, okay? If we had done a lab there at school, we could have done a lab and, you know, you can visually see these photosynthetic pigments, and it's kind of cool in that regard. But we have chlorophyll and we have carotenoids. There's another one as well. As you can see, there's another spike later on. It's not as big. It's very small. It's called xanthophylls. They didn't even put it up on the absorption spectrum here. But the only two that you need to worry about for the exam is chlorophyll and carotenoids, all right? It is these two photosynthetic pigments that are going to be housed in these little bitty regions of the thylakoid membrane. Okay. We refer to this basically, this pool of photosynthetic pigments, as a photosystem. Okay. So where do we have all this collection of photosynthetic pigments within the thylakoid membrane? It's, you know, basically housed in this little pool. Those pools are referred to as photosystems. Okay. It is the chemistry of the photosystem that's absorbing that solar energy, okay, energizing those electrons. And we have different photosynthetic pigments because we have different types of wavelengths for light. Okay, and that's what they're trying to show here. Here's the wavelength, okay, and white light, visible light, okay. There's all the colors of the rainbow right there, and they have different wavelengths. And I'm not going to ask you, you know, purple has a 380 wavelength. I don't care, okay. But there in visible light, you can see, if we're on one end of the spectrum, you can see it's a little bit more, the wavelength is a little bit more compressed there. And as you get further into the reds and oranges, you can kind of see on this side here of it, well, it starts to expand out a little bit. So there is a slightly different wavelength of light. That's why we have all the various different types of photosynthetic pigments. They capture specific wavelengths of light. That is fantastic. That is awesome, right? Why is it awesome? Well, we are going around the sun, right? And at different seasons, the Earth will tilt. So that means light is entering the atmosphere at a slightly different angle. That's going to change the light that gets filtered out before it reaches us. So we have these various different photosynthetic pigments to capture all of those various different types of wavelengths. Earth tilts one way, gets closer to the sun, there's going to be a lot more chlorophyll action. We tilt away from the sun, there's going to be a lot more carotenoid reaction, all right? And that just has to go with how the Earth is in relationship to the sun and how much sun rays travel through the atmosphere. If it travels through more atmosphere when it's away, we're going to filter out a lot of these certain types of wavelengths. Certain type of carotenoid is going to be primarily utilized. We get closer to the sun, there's not going to be as much atmosphere that it has to go through. A different photosynthetic pigment is going to be primarily used, right? So that's why we have all these various different types of photosynthetic pigments, and I'm only talking about really two, chlorophyll and carotenoids, all right? So that's what all of this kind of talks about here, all right? Wavelengths that are not absorbed are just reflected. It can't absorb everybody, okay? Can't absorb everybody. Chlorophyll, it can't absorb green. So green gets reflected back. So why do plants look green? Why do leaves look green? There you go. It's just the one spectrum that they don't absorb very well at all. Carotenoids, it's the same thing. Carotenoids absorb all of it except for oranges and yellows. Okay. So in the fall, why do plants, why do the trees, why do the leaves start turning yellow to orange? Well, there's less sun getting to these plants. There's less daylight, so there's less sunlight, okay? Less time. It has to go through more atmosphere, all right? So now the carotenoid is going to be the photosynthetic pigment primarily used. And plants turn, leaves turn, I guess I should say, yellow to orange. And then ultimately fall off. Ultimately, there's not enough sunlight during the day to maintain the tree itself. So we can just get rid of the leaves, drop the leaves, and then the plant can maintain itself. During the rest of the time of the year, spring, summer, early fall, plants are still green. Leaves are still green. Okay? And that's just because there is enough sunlight. So they're able to make a buttload of ATP and NADPH, which can fund the ability to maintain the structure of leaves, keep them green, okay? Because that's going to be the primary pigment involved.
In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. In order for
And that's interesting. And I find that interesting that we have all of these blue light lenses to help reflect the blue light that gets emitted from computers. From that explanation right there, the sun's already producing blue light. So why in the hell do we need blue light glasses to reflect that blue light so we don't absorb it anymore? There's been not a number of studies I've seen at all to support the concept of the blue light lenses on glasses to block the lights, to block that blue light because of, because it affects your brain, it affects the retina. Supposedly, it's been linked to some destruction, some wear and tear on the back of the eyeball, the retina, where your rods and cones are. It's how you pick up images and whatnot. So I haven't seen any number of studies to suggest that we have an excessive blue light problem. I mean, blue light is already in the visible light spectrum. So as the sun's producing visible light, this white light, blue's already in it. So you're exposed already. I don't know why being exposed to a computer screen would enhance that. I've never seen any studies to link excessive staring at a computer screen to cause any excessive wear and tear on the back of the retina itself. Now, I mean, if you're going to stare at a computer screen all day long, I mean, that's not exciting at all. And if you're staring at something like a really big screen, that can aggravate the eyes, especially if you're going to look down at your paper and look back up and then look down at your paper and look back up. That's the lens, and that's the suspensory ligaments that hold on to that lens that are constantly changing. So the wear and tear on the eye is really on the lens, and that's going to affect your ability to see close or far away as you get older. And the longer you stay in school, really, the greater that wear and tear is, and the likelihood you're going to have glasses. So this whole blue light thing, it's interesting. If you guys have an assignment, I think, looking at stuff, that may be something that you may want to look into to see if there's more information out there. Okay. And here, this just, brings it all back in here and talks about what gets reflected, what gets absorbed. Okay. The stuff that we see gets reflected, doesn't get absorbed. Okay. The last thing here before we dive into our photo systems here, okay, is that when we look at the different ways that light reactions occur, let me do this.